Your dark side is the key to power, not the manufactured power of manipulation and control that the weak-minded pursue, but the authentic power that emerges from complete self-integration, unflinching self-knowledge, and the courage to embrace the totality of your human nature, rather than living as a sanitized fragment of who you actually are. I have observed countless individuals crippled by their attempts to maintain the illusion of pure goodness, trapped in psychological prison cells, built from their own moral pretensions, weakened by the enormous energy required to suppress, deny, and project the shadow aspects of their personality that contain some of their greatest sources of strength, creativity, and authentic authority. The research in psychology confirms what ancient wisdom traditions have always known. The human psyche contains impulses, desires, and capabilities that civilized society labels as dark, but which are actually essential components of psychological wholeness. When these aspects are suppressed rather than integrated, they don't disappear, they operate unconsciously, creating internal conflict, projected hostility, and the kind of psychological fragmentation that makes authentic power impossible to achieve or maintain. Your dark side is not your evil side. It is your complete side. It contains your capacity for necessary ruthlessness, your willingness to face uncomfortable truths, your ability to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by others' approval, and your access to the primal energies that fuel creativity, ambition, and the kind of uncompromising commitment that extraordinary achievement requires. Today I speak of shadow integration, the psychological process of acknowledging, understanding, and consciously incorporating the aspects of yourself that you have been taught to fear, deny, or suppress, transforming them from unconscious liabilities into conscious assets that serve your authentic power, rather than undermining it. The greatest weakness plaguing modern individuals is not their darkness, but their desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of pure light, the exhausting performance of perpetual goodness that requires denying half of human nature, while projecting those denied aspects onto others, creating internal fragmentation and external conflict that prevents access to authentic strength. This false light operates through what psychologists call reaction formation, the unconscious development of attitudes and behaviors that are opposite to repressed impulses. The person who insists they never feel anger often becomes passive-aggressive. The individual who claims to have no selfish desires frequently becomes manipulative in pursuit of those desires. The one who presents themselves as purely altruistic may harbor deep resentment toward those they serve. Research reveals that individuals who attempt to suppress negative emotions experience increased psychological distress, reduced emotional intelligence, and decreased capacity for authentic relationship. The energy required to maintain these repressions is enormous, leaving less psychological resources available for creative work, strategic thinking, and the kind of sustained effort that significant achievement requires. The shadow projection that accompanies false light creates external enemies from internal conflicts. When you cannot acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness, you become obsessed with others' selfishness. When you deny your own aggressive impulses, you see aggression everywhere around you. When you suppress your own desires for power, you become suspicious of everyone else's motivations. This projection creates a paranoid and adversarial relationship with the world that makes collaboration, leadership, and authentic influence nearly impossible. Perhaps most damaging is how false light prevents access to the very qualities that authentic power requires. Your capacity for necessary ruthlessness, your willingness to make unpopular decisions, your ability to prioritize your own needs when appropriate, your comfort with competition and conflict. All of these become unavailable when you're committed to maintaining the illusion that you are purely good, selfless, and motivated only by the highest intentions. The person committed to false light becomes weak because they cannot access the full spectrum of human capability. They become predictable because their responses must always fit within narrow parameters of socially acceptable goodness. They become ineffective because they cannot take actions that might be perceived as selfish, aggressive, or morally ambiguous, even when such actions would serve legitimate objectives and genuine long-term good. True power emerges not from eliminating your dark impulses, but from consciously integrating them, transforming raw shadow material into refined psychological gold through awareness, acceptance, and strategic channeling of energies that become destructive only when repressed and projected, rather than acknowledged and directed. Shadow integration begins with honest self-examination that acknowledges the full range of your motivations, desires, and capabilities, without immediately judging them as good or bad. This requires developing what might be called moral courage, the willingness to see yourself as you actually are rather than as you wish you were, or as others expect you to be. The process involves recognizing that traits typically labeled as dark often contain the seeds of essential strengths. Your capacity for anger, when conscious and controlled, becomes righteous indignation that fuels necessary action against injustice. Your selfish impulses, when acknowledged and balanced, become healthy self-care and appropriate boundary setting. Your competitive nature, when integrated rather than repressed, becomes the drive that enables extraordinary achievement and innovation. Psychological research demonstrates that individuals who can acknowledge and work with their shadow aspects show increased creativity, enhanced problem-solving capability, and superior emotional regulation compared to those who attempt to suppress these aspects. The integration process actually expands psychological capacity rather than compromising it, creating access to previously unavailable internal resources. The alchemy occurs through what might be called conscious choice, the ability to feel aggressive impulses without automatically acting on them, to acknowledge selfish desires without being controlled by them, to recognize manipulative tendencies without deploying them destructively. This consciousness transforms potential liabilities into strategic assets that can be used when appropriate and restrained when unnecessary. Integration also involves understanding that your shadow aspects often contain inverted expressions of your greatest gifts. The person whose shadow includes excessive pride may have an extraordinary capacity for confidence and leadership. The individual whose darkness includes manipulative tendencies may possess exceptional social intelligence and influence capability. The one whose shadow contains cruelty may have unusual capacity for making difficult but necessary decisions. The key is developing what Jung called conscious relationship with these aspects, neither suppressing them nor being controlled by them, but maintaining awareness of their presence and influence, while choosing how and when to express them in service of authentic objectives, rather than unconscious compulsions. Throughout history, the individuals who achieved the most significant and lasting forms of power were those who successfully integrated their shadow aspects rather than denying them. Leaders, creators, and innovators who demonstrated that authentic strength emerges from psychological wholeness rather than moral pretension. Winston Churchill exemplifies this integration. He acknowledged his own capacity for ruthlessness, his enjoyment of conflict, and his complex relationship with power, while channeling these traits in service of defeating fascism and preserving democratic civilization. His darkness, his stubbornness, his aggressive instincts, his political opportunism became assets when applied to appropriate challenges rather than liabilities to be hidden or suppressed. Steve Jobs demonstrated shadow integration through his willingness to be demanding, perfectionist, and emotionally challenging, when these traits served the creation of extraordinary products and companies. His acknowledged capacity for cruelty and manipulation, rather than being simply destructive, became tools for achieving standards of excellence that more nice leaders could never have demanded or maintained. Frederick Douglass integrated his anger about slavery and injustice into powerful oratory and political action that helped transform American society. Rather than suppressing his rage or presenting himself as purely forgiving and peaceful, he channeled his dark emotions into sustained activism that required both moral clarity and strategic ruthlessness. Marie Curie's integration included her willingness to be professionally aggressive, personally demanding, and socially unconventional in pursuit of scientific discovery. Her shadow aspects, her ambition, her competitiveness, her willingness to ignore social expectations, became essential elements of her ability to break through barriers and achieve groundbreaking scientific work. These historical figures demonstrate that shadow integration doesn't mean becoming cruel, selfish, or destructive. It means acknowledging the full range of human capability and learning to deploy all aspects of yourself strategically, rather than being limited to narrow ranges of socially acceptable behavior that may be inadequate for significant challenges. The pattern shows that individuals who can access their complete psychological toolkit, including aspects that might be labeled as dark, possess strategic and creative advantages over those who limit themselves to culturally approved responses. They can be more flexible, more decisive, and more effective because they aren't constrained by the need to maintain images of pure goodness that reality rarely supports or rewards. The crucial distinction that separates authentic power from destructive behavior lies not in avoiding dark impulses, but in the difference between conscious integration and unconscious indulgence, between strategic deployment of shadow aspects in service of legitimate objectives versus being controlled by these impulses in ways that serve no higher purpose. Integration involves maintaining conscious choice about when, how, and why to express shadow aspects. The integrated individual can access anger when righteous indignation serves justice, can employ strategic thinking that others might call manipulative when leadership requires complex social navigation, and can prioritize their own needs when self-care enables greater service to others. These choices are made consciously, strategically, and in service of authentic objectives. Indulgence, by contrast, involves being controlled by shadow impulses, expressing anger because you cannot regulate it, manipulating others because you enjoy the sense of control, prioritizing yourself because you lack the capacity for broader consideration. These expressions are compulsive rather than chosen, reactive rather than strategic, and typically serve immediate gratification rather than long-term objectives. The research reveals that individuals who successfully integrate their shadow aspects show increased emotional intelligence, enhanced moral reasoning, and superior decision-making capability, compared to both those who suppress these aspects and those who indulge them unconsciously. Integration expands choice, while indulgence eliminates it. Integration also requires what might be called contextual wisdom, understanding that behaviors appropriate in some situations become inappropriate in others. The executive who can be ruthlessly demanding in business negotiations, while remaining compassionate in personal relationships, demonstrates integration. The person who is ruthless in all contexts demonstrates indulgence or pathology. The integration process involves developing internal authority that can evaluate whether shadow expressions serve authentic objectives or merely provide psychological relief. The integrated individual asks not "what do I feel like doing," but "what does this situation require, and how can I deploy my full range of capabilities in service of legitimate goals?" Perhaps most importantly, integration maintains accountability and consequence awareness that indulgence lacks. The integrated person takes responsibility for the effects of their shadow expressions and adjusts their behavior based on results, rather than simply satisfying impulses. They remain connected to empathy and long-term thinking, even while accessing darker capabilities when circumstances require them. Developing conscious relationship with your shadow aspects requires specific practices that build awareness, acceptance, and strategic capability, rather than simply unleashing repressed impulses without wisdom or restraint. This work transforms potential psychological liabilities into conscious assets that enhance rather than undermine your authentic power. Begin with shadow identification through honest self-examination that acknowledges impulses, desires, and capabilities you typically deny or minimize. This might include recognizing your capacity for anger, envy, selfishness, manipulation, cruelty, or other traits that you've been taught to consider wholly negative. The goal is not to celebrate these aspects, but to acknowledge their existence and understand their potential functions. Practice conscious expression of shadow aspects in controlled environments, where you can experiment safely. This might involve expressing anger through physical exercise, channeling competitive impulses through games or sports, or exploring manipulative tendencies through strategic thinking exercises. The key is developing familiarity with these energies when you're not under pressure to perform or maintain particular images. Develop what might be called shadow discernment, the ability to recognize when shadow expressions would serve legitimate objectives versus when they would merely provide psychological relief or satisfy unconscious compulsions. This requires asking questions like, what is this situation actually calling for? And how can I respond effectively rather than just reactively? Build integration skills that allow you to access shadow capabilities while maintaining connection to your higher values and long-term objectives. This might involve practicing assertiveness when you typically avoid conflict, setting boundaries when you usually accommodate others' demands, or pursuing your own interests when you typically prioritize others' needs exclusively. Create feedback systems that help you evaluate the results of shadow integration attempts. This involves paying attention to outcomes rather than just intentions, adjusting your approach based on actual effects rather than hoped-for results, and maintaining accountability for both the positive and negative consequences of accessing darker capabilities. Most importantly, develop what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to experience the discomfort that comes from acknowledging aspects of yourself that contradict your preferred self-image, while taking responsibility for integrating these aspects constructively rather than projecting them onto others or acting them out unconsciously. The path I walked demanded confronting aspects of myself that comfortable people spend their lives avoiding. The recognition that I possessed capacities for ruthlessness, manipulation, and calculated action that could be either destructive or essential, depending on how consciously I chose to deploy them in service of objectives that transcended my immediate comfort or social approval. I learned that true power emerges not from eliminating your dark impulses, but from developing conscious relationship with them, the ability to access these energies when circumstances require them, while restraining them when they would serve no constructive purpose. This integration creates psychological wholeness that makes authentic authority possible, rather than the fragmented weakness that results from living as only half a human being. The shadow work revealed that many traits I had been taught to consider purely negative contained the seeds of essential strengths. My capacity for anger became fuel for necessary action. My selfish impulses became healthy boundary setting. My manipulative tendencies became strategic, social intelligence that could serve genuine leadership objectives. Your modern world has created unprecedented pressure to maintain the illusion of pure goodness, moral perfection, and emotionally sanitized existence that eliminates access to the very psychological resources that authentic power requires. This cultural demand for false light creates a generation of people who cannot access their own strength because that strength includes aspects they have been taught to fear and suppress. But the ancient wisdom remains true. The person who can consciously integrate their complete nature possesses capabilities unavailable to those who limit themselves to narrow ranges of socially acceptable behavior. The leader who can access righteous anger when injustice demands response has advantages over the one who must remain perpetually calm. The innovator who can embrace their competitive instincts has creative resources unavailable to the one who suppresses all desires for personal achievement. Begin this integration work by acknowledging that you possess the full range of human capability, including impulses and desires that you may have spent years denying or projecting onto others. This acknowledgement is not permission for unconscious indulgence, but the beginning of conscious choice about when and how to deploy these capabilities in service of authentic objectives. Practice expressing shadow aspects in controlled environments, where you can develop familiarity with these energies without causing harm. Learn to feel anger without immediately expressing it, to acknowledge selfish desires without being controlled by them, to recognize manipulative impulses without automatically deploying them. This develops conscious relationship rather than unconscious compulsion. Most importantly, Remember that your dark side contains not your evil but your completeness, access to the full spectrum of human capability that extraordinary circumstances often require and comfortable situations rarely demand. The person who can access their complete psychological toolkit possesses strategic advantages over those limited to narrow ranges of culturally approved responses. Your dark side is indeed the key to power, but only when darkness is integrated, rather than indulged, conscious rather than compulsive, strategic rather than reactive. This integration doesn't make you cruel or selfish. It makes you complete, authentic, and capable of responses that purely light individuals cannot access. When situations require capabilities beyond conventional moral comfort zones. The shadow work is not about becoming dark, but about becoming whole, not about eliminating conscience, but about expanding choice, not about abandoning morality, but about developing the psychological resources necessary for moral action in an immoral world. In embracing your complete nature, you access the authentic power that emerges only from psychological integration, rather than moral pretension. Your darkness is not your enemy. It is your unintegrated strength waiting to be transformed from unconscious liability into conscious asset that serves your highest purposes, rather than undermining them through suppression and projection.